Welcome to Sleep Crime Stories, the place where we uncover the chilling truths behind real-life mysteries. Tonight, we explore the life of one of America's most infamous figures, Ed Gein, a man whose story continues to fascinate, disturb, and intrigue generations. Story begins. Ed Gein was born in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. From the very beginning, his life was marked by isolation and strict discipline. His mother, Augusta, was a devoutly religious woman who believed the world outside their farmhouse was corrupt and dangerous. She instilled in Ed a fear of women, sin, and almost everything beyond the farm's fields. Ed grew up largely alone, with very few friends and limited contact with the outside world. His father was distant, hard-working, and often absent, leaving Augusta's beliefs to dominate the household. She often spoke harshly, warning Ed that women were deceitful and that life outside their home was filled with temptation and evil. By the time Ed reached adolescence, the isolation had begun shaping his mind in profound ways. He became withdrawn, fascinated by death, and deeply curious about the boundaries of life and mortality. While other children explored the world outside, Ed spent hours observing the farm, reading, and listening to his mother's stories of sin and punishment. When Augusta passed away in 1945, Ed's life shifted dramatically. The woman who had dominated his world was gone, and with her, the strict moral structure that had governed him for decades disappeared. Alone on the farm, Ed's fascination with death grew more pronounced. He began collecting unusual objects, developing habits that seemed strange even to neighbors who knew him as a quiet, solitary man. Neighbors often described Ed as polite, quiet, and unassuming. On the surface, he appeared normal, a man who kept to himself, worked on the farm, and occasionally visited the local town for supplies. But behind the walls of his farmhouse, the story was very different. For years, Ed's life remained a mystery to those around him. Locals noticed odd behaviors, strange noises at night, unusual visits to the cemetery, and a deep, almost obsessive interest in the past lives of the town's inhabitants. Despite these peculiarities, no one suspected the depth of his fascination or what it would eventually reveal. It wasn't until the disappearance of a local woman in 1957 that the world would begin to uncover the truth about Ed Gein. Police investigations led them to his isolated farmhouse, a place that had long seemed ordinary, even mundane, to the community. What they discovered there would forever etch Ed Gein's name into criminal history. Even today, historians and psychologists look back on Ed's life not just for the crimes, but for the intricate interplay of isolation, obsession, and tragedy that shaped a man whose story blurs the lines between reality and legend. After the death of his mother, Ed Gein's isolation deepened. The farmhouse, once filled with the rigid structure of Augusta's rules, now echoed with emptiness. Ed spent long hours wandering the property, exploring the boundaries of his world. The barns, the sheds, the woods behind the house. Every corner became a place of curiosity, a place where he could observe and experiment with his thoughts without interruption. Neighbors began noticing small, unsettling details, items left in strange places, faint lights flickering late at night, and the occasional sound that could not easily be explained. While Ed never sought attention, the aura of mystery around him grew. Locals whispered about him, calling him odd, strange, or peculiar. Yet no one suspected the extraordinary depth of his obsessions. Ed's fascination with the past extended beyond his mother's influence. He began reading newspapers and books about local history, graveyards, and the lives of townspeople. He was drawn not to the sensational, but to the quiet, almost invisible moments of life and death. He watched people, studying their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. Some of his neighbors described him as polite, helpful even, occasionally assisting with farm work or small chores. But beneath the surface, a complex mind was at work, combining curiosity, loneliness, and a strange compulsion to explore the boundaries between life and death. The farmhouse itself began to change. It became more than just a home. It was a reflection of Ed's inner world. Rooms were arranged meticulously, objects collected with care, each item holding a particular fascination for him. The farm was no longer just a place to live. It was a world where Ed could explore ideas that seemed strange, unsettling, and mysterious to others. In the town, people continued to whisper about him, but Ed remained largely invisible. His interactions were brief, his demeanor calm, almost ordinary. Yet the combination of isolation, intense curiosity, and obsessive focus was quietly building the foundation for what would eventually shock the nation. As months passed, Ed's habits became more defined. He developed routines, patterns that would later become crucial in understanding the man behind the mystery. These routines were private, secretive, and deeply personal, yet they hinted at the complex, troubled mind that existed behind the quiet exterior. When the local authorities finally took notice, it was not sudden. It began with the disappearance of a woman in the community, a woman whose absence would start unraveling the enigma of Ed Gein. Police began looking into every aspect of his life, but for years, Ed had maintained a perfect balance. Polite, unassuming, and almost invisible, while cultivating a hidden world of curiosity, obsession, and secrecy. His story is not just one of crime. It is a story of human complexity, of isolation and obsession, of a mind that grew in the shadows of a strict upbringing. And it is this complexity that continues to fascinate historians, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts even today. The town had been living in quiet routine, but the disappearance of Bernice Warden, a local hardware store owner, began to shift that calm. People noticed the absence, whispered questions floated through the streets, and a sense of unease began to settle over the community. Police started their investigation, initially treating it as a routine missing person case, but the trail soon led them to the edges of La Crosse County, to a farmhouse that had long been the subject of hushed conversations among neighbors. The farmhouse belonged to Ed Gein. From the outside, the house appeared ordinary, weathered wood, modest in size, tucked away in the woods. Yet for those who entered it later, it would reveal a world that seemed carefully curated, strange, and mysterious. For years, Ed had created an environment that reflected his obsessions, a place that contained secrets, curiosities, and patterns that only he fully understood. Investigators noted the isolation of the farmhouse. The property was surrounded by dense trees and uneven ground, making it difficult to see what lay within from the road. Neighbors had driven past for years without realizing the extent of the unusual activity there. As police approached the farmhouse, a subtle tension filled the air. There were signs of careful preparation, doors locked in ways that suggested privacy and meticulous attention to detail. Ed, always polite and cooperative, greeted the officers calmly, offering information but revealing nothing of the deeper mysteries hidden inside his home. Inside, The farmhouse was arranged in a manner that reflected Ed's inner world. Items were carefully placed, routines evident in every corner. It was clear that this was a man who thought deeply about his surroundings, who planned meticulously, and who lived according to patterns of his own creation. Neighbors recalled peculiar details in hindsight: sounds late at night, the flicker of lights in rooms that should have been empty, and Ed's unusual interest in cemeteries and local history. All of these details, when put together, painted a picture of a man both fascinating and enigmatic. The investigation intensified. Authorities realized that the disappearance was just the tip of a much larger puzzle. Ed's farmhouse, long a place of curiosity and mystery, became the focus of the town's attention. Every room, every object, every hidden corner seemed to carry a story waiting to be uncovered. For the townspeople, the calm of everyday life had been shattered by subtle hints that something extraordinary and deeply troubling was taking place in their midst. And for the audience listening tonight, it is these quiet, tension-filled moments that make Ed Gein's story both compelling and chilling. A tale that continues to fascinate decades later. Even before the full scope of the investigation was revealed, it was clear that this was not a simple case. The farmhouse, the routines, the careful arrangements, and the mysteries hidden within reflected a mind that was both curious and deeply private, a mind that had existed on the edges of society for decades. The town waited uncertain as authorities pieced together clues, each one revealing more about the man who had lived quietly among them. And slowly, the story of Ed Gein, the man behind the farmhouse, the obsessions, and the mysteries, began to emerge, captivating the imagination and curiosity of everyone who learned of it. As investigators delved deeper into the farmhouse, the layers of Ed Gein's life began to unfold. Each room revealed carefully arranged objects, collections that hinted at his obsessions, and an environment that spoke to his fascination with life, death, and the boundaries between the two. Police officers, though trained for many unusual situations, found themselves in a place unlike any other. There was a quiet meticulousness to the way Ed had organized his surroundings. Everything had a place, everything told a story, but only to him. It was a window into a mind that had been shaped by decades of isolation, strict upbringing, and intense curiosity. Neighbors and townspeople began to realize just how little they truly knew about Ed Gein. The polite, unassuming man they had passed on the road or seen at the store was only a fragment of a much larger, more complex individual. For years, he had lived quietly, blending into the background, while building a private world that was both fascinating and mysterious. As authorities pieced together Ed's life, a psychological picture began to emerge. Experts noted his profound loneliness, the dominance of his mother in his early life, and the way isolation had nurtured an unusual set of interests and behaviors. Ed's mind had become a world unto itself, a place where curiosity and obsession intertwined. The story of the farmhouse spread slowly through the town. People whispered about the strange arrangements, the collections, and the eerie atmosphere that had long surrounded Ed's home. The mystery of the man who lived quietly for decades became a fascination. How could someone so ordinary on the surface harbor such a secret world inside? For psychologists and criminologists, Ed Gein's case became a study in human complexity. How did isolation, trauma, and obsession combine to create such a meticulous yet deeply private life? What could his behaviors tell us about the human mind when left largely unchallenged and unobserved for decades? Even as the town and the authorities tried to piece together the reality of Ed's life, the narrative began to captivate the nation. Newspapers and magazines began reporting on the unusual discoveries in the farmhouse. People were fascinated not only by the mystery, but also by the profound psychology of a man who had lived for so long in solitude, quietly observing, collecting, and thinking. The farmhouse, with its hidden corners and carefully arranged objects, became a symbol of the private life of a man who had remained almost invisible for decades. And for audiences listening to this story today, it is that tension between ordinary life and extraordinary secrecy that makes Ed Gein's story both compelling and enduring. The tale of Ed Gein is not just a story of crime or mystery, it is a story of human psychology, of the effects of isolation, and of how the mind can develop in extraordinary ways when left largely unobserved. It reminds us that behind seemingly ordinary lives, complex worlds may exist, worlds that, when revealed, are as fascinating as they are mysterious. Once news of Ed Gein's farmhouse reached the wider public, curiosity exploded. People across the country were captivated by the story of a man who had lived quietly for decades, seemingly ordinary, while harboring a world of private obsessions and meticulous routines. The media coverage added layers to the fascination. Journalists wrote of the unusual discoveries, the careful arrangements of objects, and the psychological puzzles that Ed Gein presented. Some of the coverage focused on the mystery. How could someone so polite, so calm, and so ordinary on the surface have such a hidden, enigmatic life? Others explored the psychological aspects, wondering how isolation, trauma, and obsession shaped the man behind the farmhouse. Psychologists and criminologists began analyzing Ed's life in depth. They noted that his upbringing had left a lasting impression on him. A strict, controlling mother, limited social interaction, and a world largely removed from the influence of peers. These factors, combined with his intense curiosity, helped explain the complexity of his inner life. The story also caught the attention of artists and writers. Ed Gein's life inspired fictionalized characters in books and films, stories that blended imagination with the eerie fascination of his real-life behaviors. These works helped cement his place in popular culture, ensuring that his story would remain widely discussed for decades. Despite the attention, Ed Gein himself remained quiet, polite, and cooperative. He did not seek fame, nor did he revel in the attention his story attracted. To those who knew him, he was the same solitary figure they had always seen, curious, meticulous, and deeply private. For audiences listening today, it is the contrast between Ed's ordinary exterior and the extraordinary complexity of his life that creates fascination. He was a man shaped by his environment, his upbringing, and his obsessions. An enigma that the world could not ignore once the mysteries of the farmhouse were revealed. The public's curiosity was matched by a professional interest in understanding the psychology behind Ed Gein's behaviors. Researchers explored questions of isolation, obsession, and the human mind's capacity to create private worlds that remain hidden from society. These studies helped contextualize the story, providing insight into how extraordinary behaviors can develop over time in unusual circumstances. Even decades later, Ed Gein's story continues to capture attention. His life serves as both a cautionary tale and a subject of fascination. A glimpse into how a seemingly ordinary person can harbor a complex, deeply private world. For those who explore his story carefully, it is a narrative rich with psychological insight, human curiosity, and a tension between what is seen and what remains hidden. As the story of Ed Gain spread, one thing became clear. His life was more than just an isolated incident in history. It was a window into the profound impact of upbringing, isolation, and obsession on the human mind. A story that, while unsettling, remains endlessly compelling. After the authorities completed their initial investigation, Ed Gain faced the legal process. Unlike many cases, this was not straightforward. From the beginning, it became clear that understanding Ed required more than just examining evidence. It required exploring the workings of his mind. Psychologists and medical experts were called upon to evaluate Ed. Their task was to determine not only his responsibility for certain acts, but also the state of his mental health. What emerged was a picture of a deeply troubled, isolated man, shaped by years of seclusion, strict upbringing, and unusual obsessions. The evaluations revealed that Ed had spent decades living in a world largely removed from social norms. His behavior, though strange and difficult to comprehend, was deeply tied to his experiences growing up under a controlling mother and living in almost complete isolation. Experts noted that his mind had developed patterns and routines that allowed him to navigate a life that was both solitary and obsessive. During the trial, the court had to consider these psychological findings carefully. Ed Gein was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity. This decision reflected an understanding that his actions were the product of a mind profoundly affected by years of trauma, isolation, and mental instability. He was not simply a criminal. He was a man whose life had taken a path shaped by circumstances beyond his control. For many in the public, the verdict was a moment of reflection. How could someone who appeared so ordinary commit acts that seemed extraordinary? The trial helped the world understand that Ed's life was not merely a series of criminal events, but a complex story of human psychology, curiosity, and isolation. The legal proceedings also revealed more about Ed's personality. Those who observed him in court noted his calm demeanor, polite speech, and meticulous attention to detail. Even in a courtroom filled with tension and scrutiny, Ed remained composed, a man whose inner world had always operated on its own quiet logic. Psychologists continued to study Ed Gein's case for decades. They explored how isolation, trauma, and obsessive tendencies could interact to shape unusual behaviors. His story became a key example in understanding the ways in which the human mind can adapt, change, and sometimes manifest behaviors that puzzle even the most experienced observers. The trial and its findings only added to the fascination surrounding Ed Gein. His story was no longer confined to a small town in Wisconsin. It became a case study, a cultural touchpoint, and a source of curiosity for those who wanted to understand the interplay between environment, upbringing, and the human psyche. For audiences listening tonight, this chapter of Ed Gein's story emphasizes that human behavior is complex. What seems strange or incomprehensible on the surface often has roots in experiences, isolation, and the unique ways in which individuals perceive and interact with the world around them. Each shipment that succeeded reinforced his reputation. Every law enforcement attempt that failed strengthened his myth. the United States began to take notice. Agencies like the DEA tracked shipments and patterns, but Escobar's meticulous organization made him elusive. He was never seen in the same place twice. He never traveled along predictable routes. He changed codes, contacts, and locations constantly. It was as if he were always one step ahead, moving in a world where shadows had more power than light. At home, Escobar's public image was carefully curated. Neighborhoods he supported admired him openly. He built houses for the poor, installed basic services, and offered aid to those struggling to survive. He sponsored football games, and children learned to celebrate his name as if he were a local hero. These acts of charity were deliberate. They created loyalty that law enforcement could not easily break. People became invested in his survival, whether they approved of his methods or not. Yet, the duality of his life was constant. The public saw generosity. The world, beneath the surface, witnessed calculated violence. Rival traffickers, former allies, and anyone who posed a threat to his empire disappeared without warning. Assassinations became precise, sometimes public, sometimes invisible. Messages were delivered silently through acts of brutality. Each disappearance, each execution, reinforced his reputation. Everyone understood the cost of defiance. Inside his organization, Escobar maintained control through both respect and fear. He was generous to those who were loyal, punishing only those who stepped out of line. His lieutenants were carefully chosen and trained to be intelligent, discreet, and efficient. Any misstep could result in swift retribution. And yet, he was strategic enough to never overreach, balancing discipline with reward. His people followed him not only for wealth, but for a sense of belonging. As the empire expanded, so did the risks. Rival cartels, now aware of Escobar's dominance, began to challenge him. Law enforcement pressure intensified. Colombian authorities worked alongside international agencies, aiming to dismantle the network that had grown into one of the most dangerous in history. Bombings, assassinations, and political maneuvering became everyday threats. Escobar's life was a constant calculation, each day requiring vigilance, cunning, and foresight. Despite this, Escobar remained remarkably effective at managing his empire. He anticipated threats before they arrived, neutralized rivals before they could act, and maintained operations across multiple continents simultaneously. He became a man who could exert influence without being physically present, relying on systems, trust, and intimidation. Medellin itself seemed to pulse with his presence. The city became an extension of his strategy, its streets and buildings tools in a vast network of control. The violence escalated beyond Medellin. Bombings in Bogota and other cities sent political messages. Threats against journalists and politicians became commonplace. Colombia, a nation already struggling with corruption and inequality, began to feel the full weight of Escobar's power. Ordinary citizens, even those who had benefited from his charity, understood that living under his influence was living under constant danger. Escobar's personal life, while carefully maintained, was never fully separated from his empire. His wife and children lived within layers of protection, but the threat of attack was ever present. The line between home and headquarters was blurred. Visitors, employees, and even family members were sometimes part of strategic considerations. Every interaction had potential consequences. Even those closest to him had to navigate the dual realities of generosity and danger. By the mid-80s, Escobar's operations had reached unprecedented heights. Medellin became a hub for cocaine distribution, while his influence extended internationally. Airports, highways, and shipping routes were infiltrated with his networks. Law enforcement agencies faced a dilemma. The man was too well protected, too elusive, and too embedded in local communities to capture easily. Every failed operation reinforced his aura of invincibility. Yet, with power came vulnerability. Rivals grew increasingly bold. Law enforcement became more sophisticated, and Escobar's own network began to show cracks. Loyalty, while carefully cultivated, was not absolute. The larger the empire, the more difficult it became to manage every detail. And the more visible he became, the more eyes were on him. His empire, once silent and hidden, was now a target. Escobar's response was methodical. He maintained strict communication protocols, rotated trusted operatives, and reinforced his control over neighborhoods. Violence, when necessary, was precise and calculated. Bribery and influence worked in tandem with fear to maintain order. Public relations, charity, and presence in the media created a narrative of generosity that often overshadowed his criminal acts. As the empire reached its peak, Medellin transformed. Nighttime carried both beauty and menace. The city was alive with lights, markets, and activity, yet beneath it flowed a current of tension. Every citizen understood that the man who controlled the streets had the power to save lives or destroy them with equal ease. Escobar's shadow extended across neighborhoods, hills, and rivers. It was present in whispers, glances, and the unspoken understanding that the balance of survival depended on obedience. Escobar had become more than a trafficker. He was a symbol, a force, and a shadow that could not be ignored. Power had become his constant companion, fear his tool, and loyalty his shield. Yet, even at this height, the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. The empire that stretched across continents and controlled wealth beyond imagination also carried vulnerabilities that were invisible to the untrained eye. The pressure from authorities, rivals, and the demands of managing an empire of this scale created cracks in the carefully maintained structure. Every shipment carried risk. Every ally could betray. Every decision required calculation. Escobar understood these dangers better than most, but no empire, no matter how clever, can remain untouchable indefinitely. And so the stage was set. Escobar's power was at its greatest, yet the forces arrayed against him were closing in. The balance between domination and destruction was fragile. One mistake, one miscalculation could unravel everything. The man who had risen from the streets of Medellin to control a global empire was now living in a world where survival was measured in seconds, where every shadow could conceal a threat, and where the night itself seemed to whisper warnings that even he could not ignore. Ed Gein's story also serves as a reminder of the power of observation. Those around him saw only fragments of his life: the polite neighbor, the quiet man on the road, the solitary figure in the farmhouse. Yet even those small glimpses hint at the complexity beneath. It is a lesson in understanding that appearances can be deceiving, and that human behavior is often layered, intricate, and not easily explained. As the years have passed, Ed Gein has become more than a figure in history. He's a study in human curiosity, a case explored in psychology, and a source of inspiration for writers and filmmakers seeking to understand the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. His legacy is not confined to the events themselves, but extends to the questions his life raises: the fascination it inspires, and the reflections it encourages. For those who listen to this story tonight, remember that the mind is a complex landscape. Ed's life, shaped by isolation, obsession, and the profound influence of his upbringing, is a vivid reminder of the layers within every human being. It is both a caution and an invitation to observe, to reflect, and to consider the hidden depths that exist in people around us. And so, the story of Ed Gein concludes not with a dramatic ending, but with a quiet reflection. A man shaped by circumstances, curiosity, and solitude. A figure who continues to captivate, fascinate, and inspire. His life is a testament to the extraordinary potential hidden within ordinary appearances, a reminder that even the quietest lives can contain worlds worth exploring. As investigators continue to sift through the fragments of Ed Gein's life, they noticed something interesting. While the farmhouse revealed parts of his private world, the town of Plainfield revealed something else entirely. A picture of contradiction, a life split between two versions of the same man. During interviews, many locals struggled to reconcile the Ed they knew with the stories they were beginning to hear in whispers. To some, Ed was the kind of person you barely noticed. He blended into the background like a familiar old photograph hanging on a wall, rarely the center of attention. Others, however, remembered small moments that now felt heavier in hindsight. A farmer in town mentioned how Ed would sometimes stop by with small gifts, usually vegetables or handmade trinkets. The farmer admitted, almost embarrassed, that he had once felt sorry for Ed. There was something childlike in the way Ed wondered, something gentle in his tone, something almost fragile beneath the surface. In those quiet exchanges, Ed seemed less like a mystery and more like a lonely figure searching for connection. A store clerk recalled that Ed rarely stayed long during errands. He moved with a kind of deliberate slowness, as if carrying invisible weight. His eyes didn't dart around like most people's. They lingered, observing the details others overlooked. The clerk didn't think much of it back then, but now, in the wake of everything that had come to light, those moments resurfaced with a new sense of importance. Another neighbor remembered how Ed would repair small items for people in the community. A broken hinge, a cracked chair leg, a loose door handle. He fixed them without expecting money, almost grateful for something to keep his hands busy. It made people believe he was simply a quiet, hard-working man, someone who preferred tasks over conversation. Perhaps the most telling reflection came from a woman who remembered seeing Ed walk along the long rural roads late at night. She never understood why he chose the darkness instead of the daylight for his walks, but she never questioned it. Many rural towns were like that. People kept to themselves, respecting privacy like it was an unspoken rule. Even so, she recalled one detail that lingered with her through the years. Ed always looked like he was thinking deeply, as if the night air helped him sort through thoughts too heavy to carry indoors. As these stories began weaving together, a clearer picture emerged. Ed was someone who had lived in two worlds, one visible, one hidden. The visible world was quiet and ordinary. The hidden world was ruled entirely by the habits he developed through years of isolation and silence. This dual existence created a kind of echo that followed him everywhere he went, shaping the way people remembered him long after the investigation started. The more the authorities learned, the more they realized that Ed's life wasn't defined by sudden actions or impulsive decisions. Instead, it was shaped by slow, subtle patterns that unfolded over decades. Patterns influenced by his past, his environment, and the loneliness that clung to him like a shadow. And while investigators continued piecing together timelines and testimonies, the town itself began reflecting on the unsettling truth that had quietly sat among them for so long. It wasn't that Ed had intentionally hid from people. It was that nobody ever thought to look deeper. In a community built on routine and familiarity, the stillness of Ed's life allowed him to exist unnoticed. Like a page in a book everyone walked past but never opened. This realization became one of the most haunting parts of the entire story, not because of what happened, but because of how easily an entire life, complex, layered, misunderstood, can remain unseen until the very end. As winter settled over Plainfield, investigators continued to unravel the threads of Ed Gein's past, not just through physical evidence, but through memories shared by those who had crossed paths with him. Each recollection added another shade to the portrait of a man who lived quietly on the outskirts of understanding, almost like a figure caught between time and solitude. One of the most revealing insights came from a retired school teacher who had known Ed during his childhood years. She remembered him as a polite boy, always sitting in the back row, listening more than speaking. He rarely raised his hand, rarely caused trouble, and rarely interacted with the other children. He seemed detached from the playful world around him, observing life rather than participating in it. She recalled a moment that remained with her for decades. During a writing assignment, Ed had described his home life with a seriousness unusual for children his age. His words were simple, but the tone felt older than he was, as if he carried responsibilities that were invisible to others. The teacher had wondered at the time if he was lonely, but in those days, teachers didn't pry into personal affairs. They simply taught, observed, and hoped their students found their way. A childhood friend, now an elderly man, offered a softer memory. He remembered going to Ed's farm as a boy and noticing how tidy everything seemed. Ed was always organized, always careful with tools, always focused on tasks with a quiet dedication. He wasn't like other kids. He preferred steady routines over games, chores over adventures. His world seemed structured, controlled, and shaped by rules only he understood. Over the years, these small patterns strengthened. Ed became someone who relied heavily on routine. He walked the same paths, visited the same stores, listened to the same radio programs each evening, and followed the same schedule day after day. It created a sense of predictability that made him feel safe. When life is quiet and unchanged, the mind grows accustomed to its own rhythm. This structured life became even more pronounced after his mother's passing. With the farmhouse growing quieter and the seasons passing without interruption, Ed slipped deeper into a world made entirely of memory and solitude. The community saw a simple, quiet man, but they never saw the depth of the silence inside his home. Silence that held the weight of years. Silence that shaped his evenings and thoughts. Investigators noted that many people who lived alone in rural areas often developed unique habits to cope with isolation. Ed was no different. His routines, once small comforts, slowly became the framework of his existence. He built a life that didn't require many interactions, a life where loneliness became familiar rather than frightening, a life where the boundaries between the past and present blurred gently over time. As these reflections were gathered, a shared sentiment appeared among residents. Ed wasn't someone people feared. He was someone they simply overlooked. And that, more than anything, was what made the story so unsettling. He lived among them, yet apart from them, a figure woven into the town's landscape, like an old barn or a weathered road sign. Always there, seldom noticed. The investigators who studied Ed's life understood this quietly profound truth. Sometimes the mysteries that unfold in small towns are not abrupt or sudden. Sometimes they are the slow accumulation of loneliness, habits, memories, and an inner world shielded behind polite smiles and quiet routines. And as winter deepened, the town of Plainfield found itself confronting not only the life Ed had lived, but the silence in which it had all unfolded. A silence that now felt heavier, older, and far more mysterious than anyone had ever imagined. As investigators continued interviewing those who knew Ed, one recurring theme began to stand out: the profound stillness of his life. It wasn't the silence of someone hiding a secret, but the silence of someone who had simply grown accustomed to being alone. One local mechanic described a moment he had always brushed off until the investigation made him revisit it. He remembered Ed coming into the workshop with an old piece of farm equipment that needed repair. The mechanic noticed how Ed watched the tools with careful attention, almost as if he admired them, not for what they could do, but for the precision and structure they represented. He wasn't impatient or distracted like most customers. Instead, he stood quietly, hands clasped, absorbing the rhythm of the work around him. The mechanic said that Ed asked simple questions now and then, almost out of curiosity rather than necessity. Questions about how certain machines functioned, how parts fit together, how old tools were repaired. His tone was soft, polite, and steady. The mechanic remembered thinking Ed seemed more interested in understanding how things worked than in getting his own repairs done quickly. Another community member, a librarian who knew Ed from his occasional visits, shared a different perspective. She remembered Ed coming in during the quieter hours, choosing books that seemed almost random. Sometimes they were about history, sometimes farming, sometimes anatomy or medical practices. But what stood out to her was not the topics themselves. It was the way he read, slowly, methodically, page by page, as though each line was a puzzle he wanted to solve. She recalled that Ed never rushed. He treated reading the same way he treated people, with quiet patience. The library was one of the few public places where he seemed comfortable, perhaps because it mirrored the quiet of his own home. She said she often saw him sitting alone at a table near the window, letting the natural light fall over the pages, completely absorbed in whatever he was learning. As these stories were gathered, investigators began to notice a pattern. Ed wasn't a man driven by impulse. He was someone shaped by routine, observation, and a need to understand the world at his own pace. His curiosity wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady and persistent, born from years of solitude and the absence of companionship. A former co-worker from Ed's short-lived job at a sawmill offered yet another perspective. He described Ed as reliable but distant, someone who did his tasks with care but never lingered in conversation. While others gathered during breaks, Ed often chose to stay by himself, sitting quietly with a thermos of coffee, staring at the horizon like he was waiting for something only he could see. What stood out in all these recollections was how consistent Ed was. People change depending on who they're around, but Ed rarely did. His quietness didn't shift. His politeness didn't fade. His slow, deliberate manner never broke. This consistency made him easy to overlook, and in a small town, someone who doesn't draw attention isn't often remembered until much later. The investigators noted that Ed's entire existence seemed built on the foundations laid early in his life: obedience, structure, isolation, and an unwavering attachment to routine. He moved through the world like someone following a map only he had seen, guided by memories, habits, and a quiet inner landscape shaped long before anyone realized how influential those early years had been. It became clear that Ed's life wasn't defined by sudden moments, but by a long chain of quiet days, unchanging seasons, and internal thoughts that rarely reached the surface. His story was not about dramatic revelations. It was about the slow, understated formation of a mind living at the crossroads of memory and solitude. And as the investigation deepened, those who reflected on Ed's presence in their lives found themselves wondering how many clues they had once seen without realizing their significance. Not out of guilt, but out of the simple truth that human behavior often reveals itself only in hindsight. In the stillness of winter, the picture of Ed Gein grew less like a mystery to be solved and more like a life to be understood, layer by layer, memory by memory, until the quiet patterns of his world finally began to make sense. As the investigation progressed, Ed's life began to reveal itself not only through direct testimony, but through the subtle patterns woven into the fabric of the small town that had unknowingly carried his story for decades. Plainfield was the kind of place where time moved slowly, where neighbors recognized each other by the sound of their footsteps on gravel, and where the passing of seasons was marked not by calendars, but by the changing color of the fields. In such a quiet place, the presence of someone like Ed blended seamlessly into the landscape, becoming a part of the everyday life that people rarely pause to examine. What investigators realized now, as they pieced together the threads of memory, was that Ed's life was shaped not just by personal choices, but by the quiet rhythm of a town where solitude was common and questions were few. One of the most revealing accounts came from a local woman who remembered seeing Ed often at the general store where she worked. She recalled how he moved with deliberate calmness, never rushing, never showing signs of frustration or urgency. Every step he took, every item he inspected, seemed to follow an internal set of rules he had established long ago. He would often arrive early in the morning, when the aisles were quiet and the floors still smelled faintly of fresh cleaning. He preferred those hours, she said, because they allowed him to exist in the world without interruption. The way he picked up canned goods, examining the labels slowly, almost thoughtfully, left a lasting impression on her. In hindsight, she realized that Ed wasn't simply shopping. He was studying the world around him in small, careful steps, taking in details others ignored. Another resident, a retired farmer, described seeing Ed almost every week, walking along the long rural road that stretched between town and the outskirts. The farmer remembered how Ed rarely waved, but always nodded politely as he passed by. His gaze stayed low, as though the road itself held more significance than the people walking on it. The farmer said he sometimes wondered what Ed thought about during those long walks. Perhaps he was thinking about his childhood, or about the farm he maintained alone, or perhaps about memories he never shared with anyone. What struck the farmer most was the consistency of those walks. They happened in every season: rain, snow, heat, or cold. Ed walked with the same steady pace year after year, like a man who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his own footsteps. A former classmate, now an elderly man, shared an even deeper layer of Ed's past. He said that when they were young, Ed always seemed to carry a sense of distance, even during group activities. While other boys ran and chased each other across fields, Ed stayed near the edges, observing, but rarely joining. His quiet presence wasn't seen as strange, just different. The classmate recalled that Ed often brought books to school that seemed older than the ones most students read. Books about farming practices, religious stories, simple manual guides. The boys didn't always understand why he chose those topics, but to Ed, they seemed like anchors in a world that felt too fast and too unpredictable. Looking back now, the classmate realized that Ed had always lived within a structure shaped by routine and reinforced by silence, a structure that became more rigid as he grew older. Investigators learned that after Ed's mother passed away, this structure tightened further. The farmhouse, once filled with her voice and her strict presence, became a sanctuary of stillness. Ed retreated deeper into habits that made him feel connected to a life that no longer existed. The rooms froze in time, untouched, preserved as if waiting for days that would never return. This attachment to the past, this inability to let go of what was familiar, became one of the defining traits of Ed's adult life. It influenced the way he moved through the world, the way he interacted with others, and the way he perceived himself in relation to the community. As investigators processed this information, they began to understand that Ed's story was not only about the events surrounding him, but about the psychological landscape he inhabited. His life was shaped by the echoes of a childhood ruled by strict discipline, rigid beliefs, and emotional isolation. These echoes continued into adulthood, guiding his choices, shaping his worldview, and creating a sense of comfort in solitude that grew stronger each year. The townspeople who remembered Ed weren't describing a dangerous man or a threatening figure. They were describing someone deeply shaped by loneliness and habit. Someone whose life unfolded quietly, without dramatic shifts, in the shadows of routine. Even the sheriff who oversaw the early stages of the investigation noted that rural life often created environments where individuals could remain unnoticed for years. In cities, unusual behavior draws attention quickly. But in small towns, where people keep to themselves and privacy is respected almost like a cultural tradition, it is easy for someone to live entirely within their own world without raising suspicion. Ed was a product of that world. He didn't hide intentionally. He simply lived the way he always had, unnoticed and undisturbed, as the seasons changed and the years passed. This realization brought a heavy stillness to the investigators' work. They understood now that Ed's story was not just about isolation, but about how quietly a person can slip between the cracks of everyday life. How the simplest routines can mask deeper complexities. How a polite smile can conceal the weight of a past no one ever thought to question. As investigators delved deeper into the memories of those who had known Ed, they found themselves piecing together a mosaic made not of dramatic events, but of small, almost invisible details that collectively revealed the inner framework of his life. These details painted a picture of a man shaped profoundly by his environment, by the rhythms of rural living, by the emotional boundaries set during his childhood, and by the quiet routines that guided his adult years. The more people reflected on Ed, the clearer it became that his story was not defined by sudden shifts or explosive turning points. Instead, it was the slow evolution of a life lived on the margins, where silence grew thick and habits became anchors to a past that never fully loosened its grip. One of the librarians who had seen Ed throughout the years shared a memory that stayed with her long after she retired. She recalled how, every few weeks, Ed would arrive just as the afternoon sun dipped low behind the pine trees outside the library windows. This was the time of day when the building felt the most peaceful. The echoes of school children had faded, the morning's bustle had settled, and only the soft whisper of pages turning filled the room. Ed seemed to gravitate toward this tranquility. He would stand near the entrance for a moment, removing his hat as though entering a sacred place, before moving toward the back where the older books were kept. The librarian remembered how he handled each book with a kind of quiet reverence, as if the worn pages held pieces of a world he longed to understand through reflection rather than experience. She often wondered what he thought during those quiet visits. Perhaps these books offered him a way to explore ideas that felt unreachable within the solitude of his farmhouse. A different resident, a man who had lived on the outskirts of Plainfield for most of his life, spoke of his occasional conversations with Ed. He described them not as meaningful discussions, but as brief exchanges marked by politeness and a kind of gentle awkwardness. Ed never spoke loudly. His voice was soft, nearly hesitant, like someone choosing every word with care before releasing it into the world. What struck the man most was the sense that Ed always seemed slightly out of step with the flow of everyday conversation. When talked to about current events, he would nod, but rarely expand. When asked how he was doing, he would answer simply that everything was fine, even when his eyes suggested a deeper, private world of thoughts that didn't translate easily into words. There was nothing alarming about these interactions, just a sense that Ed had become accustomed to living internally, communicating only as much as was needed to move through the outer world without drawing attention. Another resident, a hardware store owner who knew Ed for many years, offered a perspective that revealed even more about his daily habits. The owner remembered how Ed came in often to buy small tools, replacement screws, nails, and the occasional can of paint. Not large quantities, always just enough for a specific task. He moved through the aisles with a sense of intention, never wandering or browsing aimlessly. It was as if he had already mapped out each section in his mind and knew exactly where to go before he entered. The owner recalled how Ed would sometimes pause to examine something very ordinary, like a piece of rope or a latch for a wooden door, holding it in his hands silently, as though the item reminded him of something from long ago. He never rushed. He treated these simple purchases with the same seriousness others reserved for important decisions. And while he rarely made small talk, the owner said Ed always thanked him kindly before leaving, tipping his hat in a gesture that now felt like a fading symbol of a life untouched by modern hurry. Investigators began to understand that what made Ed such an enigmatic figure was not the presence of something unusual, but the absence of anything that drew attention. He lived a life defined by invisibility. Nothing he did appeared suspicious. Nothing he said suggested hidden turmoil. The quiet steadiness of his presence created a kind of camouflage. In a town where people respected privacy, his solitude was seen not as a warning sign, but as a personal preference. And because rural life often fosters a sense of independence, Ed's self-sufficiency was admired by some, ignored by others, and questioned by almost no one. One of the investigators, reflecting on these collected stories, noted that Ed's life demonstrated a quiet truth about human nature. People can exist beside us for years, even decades, without revealing the deeper layers of their inner experiences. A person may speak rarely, but think constantly. They may interact politely, yet hold onto memories that shape every aspect of their behavior. Ed was one such person. His internal world was vast, shaped by early influences that left deep emotional impressions. His external world, however, was small, predictable, and firmly tethered to routines that brought him comfort as the years passed. This contrast between the inner and outer worlds fascinated the investigative team. It showed how someone could live an entire life following patterns so consistent and quiet that even those who interacted with him regularly never thought to look beneath the surface. And as these recollections accumulated, the story of Ed Gain transformed from a set of isolated memories into a complex narrative, one that raised questions about loneliness, the passage of time, and the ways in which people adapt to the absence of companionship. In the slowly falling winter snow, as the investigation continued, Plainfield found itself recalling more and more about the man they once knew only in passing. The town began to realize that Ed's story was not simply a sequence of events, but a long, intertwining path influenced by silence, shaped by solitude, and sustained by the quiet routines of a life lived out of sight, yet always on the edge of the community's awareness. As the seasons changed once more, Plainfield remained quiet. The slow rhythm of rural life uninterrupted except for the occasional whisper of Ed Gain's presence in town. Residents began to reflect not on dramatic events, but on the way he moved through life with a steady, unhurried pace, as if time itself bent slightly to accommodate his own inner schedule. Children who had once watched him from a distance remembered a figure who walked carefully, who observed rather than engaged, whose gestures were polite but deliberate. For those who knew him as a neighbor, he was neither frightening nor extraordinary. He was simply consistent, a fixture of the small town, like the aging barns that lined the roads, present yet quietly unobtrusive. Yet when investigators pieced together the fragments of his life, it became clear that Ed's outward calm masked an inner world, shaped by isolation, curiosity, and the deep, lasting impressions of his upbringing. Ed's farmhouse, now fully examined, told a story beyond what anyone had imagined. Every room, every piece of furniture, every carefully organized shelf revealed the meticulousness with which he had lived for decades. There were patterns, repetitions, rituals, not shocking or dangerous, but revealing in the way they mirrored his internal need for order and predictability. For Ed, routine was not simply habit. It was a framework for existence. Every day, every hour had its purpose. Meals were prepared the same way. Objects were stored in precise locations, and even the smallest tasks were executed with the kind of precision that spoke to a mind both methodical and solitary. Investigators realized that it was in these details, the small, almost invisible actions, that Ed's story truly unfolded, offering insight not into sensationalized events, but into the quiet complexity of his inner life. Residents recalled countless small interactions over the years, each adding another layer to the portrait of a man who had long existed at the periphery of the community's attention. One elderly neighbor remembered how Ed would sometimes linger at the edge of a field, watching birds or studying the movement of clouds in the sky. Another spoke of seeing him quietly repairing fences, tending small patches of land, or carefully restoring old tools. These moments, though mundane, revealed a profound patience and attention to detail. They showed a man who, despite the isolation and silence of his life, engaged deeply with the world in ways that were subtle yet unwavering. Each of these recollections emphasized the central theme. Ed's existence was defined not by drama or spectacle, but by a persistent, quiet engagement with the small, ordered patterns of life. The psychological dimension of Ed's story became increasingly clear to those studying him. He was a man shaped by his mother's strict beliefs and the emotional constraints of a childhood marked by control and fear. These influences, compounded over years of isolation, created a mind that found comfort in repetition, in familiarity, and in the controlled world of his own making. The external life, the life that townspeople observed, was simple and polite, almost unremarkable. But the inner life, formed by decades of reflection, observation, and solitary habit, was rich, detailed, and entirely private. This contrast between internal complexity and external normality fascinated investigators, psychologists, and those who would later study his life as a case study in human behavior. Finally, as Ed's story concluded with the closure of the investigation, there was a sense of reflection that lingered not just in the minds of those who studied him, but in the town itself. Plainfield realized that a life can be both ordinary and extraordinary, visible and hidden, gentle and complex. Ed Gain was not defined by sensational tales or dramatic headlines alone. He was defined by the accumulation of quiet moments, deliberate choices, and the intricate patterns of a mind that had navigated decades of solitude. His life became a reminder of the profound layers that exist within every human being, the unseen structures that shape behavior, and the ways in which time, routine, and circumstance can create worlds hidden in plain sight. And so, the story of Ed Gein closes not with sudden drama, but with reflection, insight, and understanding. A life lived quietly, observed occasionally, and remembered in layers of memory and contemplation. The farmhouse, the town, the roads he walked, all remain as silent witnesses to a life that was complex, enigmatic, and ultimately a reminder that human behavior often holds more depth than anyone can fully perceive. For those who listen tonight, the story invites thought, empathy, and curiosity, leaving a lasting impression long after the narrative fades, a meditation on the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. As the years passed, Ed Gein became a figure of both curiosity and caution in Plainfield's history, a man whose life reflected the quiet intensity of isolation, the weight of routine, and the unseen impact of early experiences. The farmhouse, once filled with the echoes of his solitude, now stands in memory as a symbol of a life lived largely apart from the world, yet never entirely separate from it. Every creaking floorboard, every shadowed corner, whispered the story of a man shaped by upbringing, solitude, and the invisible patterns of daily existence. For the townspeople who had crossed paths with him, Ed's presence left subtle marks rather than dramatic ones. A nod at the edge of a field, a polite exchange in a store, the steady rhythm of his footsteps along familiar roads, all became fragments of a narrative that only in hindsight revealed its depth. What they had once overlooked, they now saw as part of a broader understanding that even the quietest life contains mysteries, and that the patterns of thought and habit can shape a person as profoundly as the events of a single day. Psychologists and historians studying Ed's life later reflected on the lessons embedded within his story. It was a testament to the complexity of human behavior, the influence of childhood, and the ways in which isolation and routine can shape perception, action, and thought. Ed's life demonstrated that not all stories are defined by explosive events. Some unfold slowly, silently, and subtly, leaving traces that require careful observation and reflection to fully understand. His existence reminded observers that understanding a person requires more than looking at actions. It requires seeing the life behind them, the mind navigating quietly in the spaces between. And so, the story of Ed Gain closes not with sudden revelation or dramatic finale, but with the weight of reflection, understanding, and human curiosity. A life once lived quietly, largely unseen, now endures as a study of solitude, routine, and the extraordinary depth hidden within the ordinary. For those who hear this story tonight, it serves as a reminder that behind every person, behind every small gesture, lies a world of thought, habit, and memory waiting to be considered, contemplated, and understood. As the wind whispers through the empty streets of Plainfield and the farmhouse remains silent in its final stillness, the story of Ed Gain lingers, not as a tale of horror, but as a meditation on life, isolation, and the subtle mysteries that dwell quietly in the hearts and minds of those around us. A story to think on, a life to reflect upon, and a quiet, lingering reminder that every life, no matter how unremarkable it may seem from the outside, carries layers of depth, history, and complexity that few ever truly see. The farmhouse stands empty, the town moves on, but the echoes of a life once lived in careful, measured solitude remain, quietly teaching, silently reminding, and leaving a story that will be remembered. Not for what was sensational, but for what it revealed about the hidden structures of human life.